Frank Sullivan's weathered hands froze on his coffee mug, steam rising between his trembling fingers as Rex's urgent bark shattered the pre-dawn silence. The German shepherd's amber eyes locked onto something beyond the frosted window, something that made the old Marine's blood run cold. There, half buried in the Montana snow, lay a woman in a blood-soaked FBI jacket. Rex bolted toward the door, his massive frame trembling with an intensity Frank hadn't seen since Afghanistan. The woman's lips moved weakly against the white ground, forming words that would change everything. "Don't call local police?" Frank's mind raced back to Danny's last letter, warnings about corruption, about danger closer than anyone imagined. His son's German shepherd whined softly, as if recognizing a ghost from their shared past. "Get the first aid kit," Frank whispered to himself, his military training overriding 75 years of learned caution. What had this woman discovered? And why did Rex seem to know her? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Frank Sullivan had learned to measure his days not in hours, but in the spaces between memories. At 75, the former Marine moved through his Pine Ridge, Montana home with the deliberate precision of a man who understood that routine was the only thing standing between him and the abyss. The modest two-bedroom house sat on 3 acres at the edge of town, where the pavement gave way to pine forests and the nearest neighbor was Dorothy Henderson, a quarter-mile down the gravel road. Frank had bought the place with Martha 40 years ago, back when his knees didn't creak like old floorboards and his hands didn't shake when he poured his morning coffee. Rex lay by the stone fireplace, his thick coat a mixture of black and tan that caught the amber light from the flames. The German shepherd was 8 years old now, a veteran like Frank, though his war had been in the mountains of Afghanistan. Rex had been Danny's dog, Staff Sergeant Daniel Sullivan's faithful companion, until an IED took Danny's life 5 years ago. The Army had shipped Rex home to Frank, along with a folded flag and condolences that felt as hollow as the empty chair at Frank's kitchen table. Every morning, Frank set 2 bowls on the floor, one for Rex, one for the memory of the son who would never come home. The ritual hurt, but some pain was worth keeping. The town of Pine Ridge nestled in a valley surrounded by snow-capped peaks, population 3,847 according to the weathered sign at the town limits. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the diner served coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and where Sheriff Bobby Morrison had kept the peace for nearly 2 decades. Frank's days followed a pattern as predictable as sunrise. Coffee at 6, Rex's walk at 7, checking the mailbox for his VA disability check, and avoiding the looks of pity from townspeople who remembered when he'd been somebody, back when Martha's laugh filled the house and Danny called every Sunday. The money was tight. Social Security and his military pension barely covered the mortgage, utilities, and Rex's expensive cancer medication. The German shepherd had been diagnosed 6 months ago, and the vet bills were bleeding Frank dry. But Rex was all he had left of Danny, and Frank would eat beans for a year before he'd let that dog suffer. Dorothy Henderson stopped by twice a week with casseroles and gossip, her silver hair always perfectly styled despite being 68 and widowed for a decade. She was kind enough, though Frank sometimes caught her watching him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Neighbors in small towns looked out for each other, he told himself. That's all it was. What Frank didn't know was that his carefully ordered world was about to shatter like ice under a sledgehammer, and that Rex, loyal, dying Rex, was carrying secrets that would shake Pine Ridge to its foundation. The blizzard had been howling for 3 days, turning Pine Ridge into an island of white isolation. Frank's arthritis ached something fierce, and Rex had been restless all morning, pacing between the front door and the kitchen window with an urgency that set Frank's teeth on edge. The dog's behavior reminded him too much of Afghanistan, the way military dogs acted when they sensed danger before the humans caught on. "What's got into you, boy?" Frank muttered, watching Rex's ears swivel toward sounds only he could hear. The German shepherd's amber eyes were fixed on something beyond the frosted glass, his massive frame trembling with barely contained energy. When Frank finally looked outside, his breath caught in his throat. There, 20 yards from his front porch, a dark shape lay crumpled in the snow. At first he thought it might be a deer, but as his eyes adjusted to the white glare, he could make out the unmistakable outline of a human form. Frank's hands shook as he pulled on his winter coat, not from the cold, but from the sudden surge of adrenaline he hadn't felt since Vietnam. Rex was already at the door, whining low in his throat, the sound a dog makes when death is near. The snow crunched under Frank's boots as he made his way toward the figure, Rex bounding ahead with surprising agility for a dog fighting cancer. The wind whipped ice crystals against Frank's face, but he barely noticed. All his attention was focused on the woman lying motionless in the drift. She was young, maybe 35, with dark hair plastered to her skull by melting snow. Her FBI jacket was torn and stained with blood that had frozen into crimson patches against the navy blue fabric. Her face was pale as the snow around her, lips tinged blue with cold, but her chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths. Frank dropped to his knees beside her, his military medic training kicking in after 50 years of dormancy. He checked her pulse, weak but steady, and looked for obvious wounds. A deep gash ran along her left temple, and her jacket was soaked with blood from what looked like a gunshot wound to her shoulder. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Frank's voice came out steadier than he felt. The woman's eyelids fluttered, and she made a soft sound of pain. Rex circled them both, his nose working overtime, sampling scents that Frank couldn't detect. The dog's behavior was strange, protective, but also somehow familiar, as if he recognized something about this injured stranger. The woman's eyes opened suddenly, dark brown and filled with pain, but also with an intelligence that cut through her obvious distress. She grabbed Frank's jacket with surprising strength, pulling him closer. "Don't!" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Don't call local police." Frank felt his blood chill. "You need medical attention. I have to—" "No." Her grip tightened. "They killed my partner." "Sheriff Morrison. He's not who you think he is." The name hit Frank like a physical blow. Bobby Morrison had been in his squad in Vietnam, a young lieutenant who'd saved Frank's life during the Tet Offensive. They'd lost touch after the war, but when Frank moved to Pine Ridge 15 years ago, Bobby had been there, older and wearing a sheriff's badge, but still the same man who'd pulled Frank from a burning helicopter. "Morrison's a good man," Frank said automatically, but even as the words left his mouth, something cold settled in his stomach. The woman's eyes were urgent now, fever-bright with pain and desperation. "Maria Santos, FBI. I've been investigating drug trafficking through this area. Morrison's been protecting the operation." Frank's world tilted. He thought of all the times Bobby had stopped by for coffee, all the stories they'd shared about the old days. The man had been at Martha's funeral, had checked on Frank during the worst of his grief. "That's impossible," Frank said, but his voice lacked conviction. Maria's hand moved to her jacket pocket, fingers fumbling with something inside. She pulled out a small object, a micro SD card, no bigger than a fingernail. "Evidence," she gasped. "Everything's on here. Morrison, the drug routes, the money. My partner and I were supposed to meet our backup tonight, but they got to us first." Rex suddenly stiffened, his head turning toward the road. A low growl rumbled in his chest, the kind of warning sound he'd made in Afghanistan when Taliban fighters were moving through the mountains. "Someone's coming," Frank said, his Marine instincts taking over. He could hear it now, the distant rumble of an engine, growing closer. Maria tried to sit up, panic flashing across her features. They can't find me. If they do, we're both dead. Frank made a decision that would have seemed impossible an hour ago. He slipped his arms under Maria's shoulders and knees, surprised by how light she was, how fragile she felt against his chest. His back screamed in protest, but he ignored it. "Rex, house," he commanded, and the German shepherd bounded toward the front door. Frank carried Maria up the porch steps, her blood leaving a trail of red drops in the snow. Behind them, headlights swept across the trees, still a quarter-mile away but approaching fast. Inside, Frank laid Maria on the living room couch, grabbing blankets from the closet and pressing towels against her wounds. She was shivering violently now, shock setting in as the warmth of the house began to thaw her frozen body. "The card," she whispered, pressing the micro SD into Frank's palm. "If something happens to me, get it to the FBI field office in Billings. Agent Sarah Chen is running the operation." Frank stared at the tiny piece of plastic and metal, hardly bigger than his thumbnail. Such a small thing to contain secrets worth killing for. Rex positioned himself by the front window, his body tense with alertness. The headlights were closer now, turning into Frank's driveway. Frank quickly dimmed the living room lights and moved to the window. A Pine Ridge Sheriff's Department cruiser sat in his driveway, engine running, exhaust visible in the cold air. Frank recognized the vehicle. It was Deputy Miller's car, though he couldn't see who was inside from this angle. The car sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Frank held his breath, one hand on Maria's shoulder to keep her still, the other clutching the micro SD card so tightly it left marks on his palm. Finally, the cruiser backed out of the driveway and disappeared down the road, its taillights swallowed by the swirling snow. Frank looked down at Maria, who had lost consciousness again, her breathing shallow but steady. Rex padded over and lay down beside the couch, his intelligent eyes moving between Frank and the wounded woman, as if he understood exactly what was at stake. Frank had spent 5 years trying to forget he'd ever been a soldier. Now, holding evidence of corruption and looking at a woman who'd nearly died bringing it to light, he felt something stir inside him that he'd thought was dead and buried with his son. The war had come to Pine Ridge, and whether he wanted it or not, Frank Sullivan was back in the fight. Frank's hands trembled as he inserted the micro SD card into his old laptop, a relic from when Martha was still alive, and insisted they needed to keep up with the times. The screen flickered to life, displaying folders labeled with dates and cryptic abbreviations that meant nothing to him. But when he clicked on the first video file, his world collapsed. The footage was grainy, shot from what appeared to be a hidden camera inside a warehouse. Frank watched Sheriff Bobby Morrison, his old squadmate, the man who'd saved his life in Vietnam, accept a briefcase from a thin man in an expensive suit. Money changed hands, thick stacks of bills that Morrison counted with practiced efficiency. "Jesus Christ, Bobby," Frank whispered, his voice cracking. The video continued, showing Morrison giving orders to deputies Frank recognized: Miller, Jackson, Henderson. They loaded unmarked boxes into vehicles, coordinated timing, discussed routes through the mountain passes that would avoid federal checkpoints. It was a well-oiled machine, running drugs from the Canadian border through Pine Ridge and south to Denver, Salt Lake City, and beyond. But it was the final video that made Frank's blood run cold. The timestamp showed it was recorded just 3 days ago. Morrison stood in his office talking to someone off camera. Frank strained to listen to the audio. "The FBI agents are getting too close," Morrison was saying. "Santos and Rodriguez have been sniffing around the lumber mill. We need to handle this before they connect the dots." A voice Frank didn't recognize responded. "What about the old man, Sullivan? He's been asking questions about his son's death." Morrison's face hardened. "Danny Sullivan was a problem we solved 5 years ago." His father doesn't need to know that his boy died because he stumbled onto our operation in Afghanistan. Some secrets are better buried. Frank's laptop slipped from his numb fingers, clattering to the floor. Rex whined softly, sensing his distress. The room spun around Frank as the truth hit him like shrapnel. Danny hadn't died in a random IED explosion. He'd been murdered because he'd discovered Morrison's drug operation had extended all the way to Afghanistan, using military supply chains to move product. His son had died trying to be a good soldier, a good man. And Frank had spent 5 years grieving what he thought was a senseless tragedy when it had actually been calculated murder. On the couch, Maria stirred, her eyes fluttering open. Did you watch it?" she asked weakly. Frank knelt beside her, his face a mask of controlled rage. "My son, they killed my son." Maria's expression softened with understanding. "I'm sorry." We found references to Afghanistan in the financial records. A staff sergeant, Daniel Sullivan, who was asking questions about supply discrepancies. Morrison's people silenced him before he could file a report. Frank stood slowly, his joints protesting, but his mind clearer than it had been in years. Rex watched him with intelligent amber eyes, and Frank suddenly understood why the dog had been so agitated lately. Rex had recognized Maria's scent, or something about the situation. Military dogs never forgot danger. "There's more," Maria continued, struggling to sit up. "Morrison isn't running this alone. Someone else is calling the shots. Someone with connections high enough to protect the operation for over a decade." Before Frank could respond, Rex's ears perked up and he padded to the front window. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Not the warning sound from earlier, but something different. Recognition mixed with hostility. Frank peered through the curtains and saw Dorothy Henderson walking up his driveway, carrying her usual covered casserole dish. But something was different about her approach. Her head swiveled left and right as she walked, checking the tree line, the road, the windows of his house. It was the behavior of someone conducting surveillance, not bringing comfort food to a neighbor. "Hide," Frank whispered to Maria, helping her slide behind the couch. "Stay quiet, no matter what happens." The knock on his door came 3 times, Dorothy's usual pattern. Frank composed his face and opened it, forcing a smile he didn't feel. "Evening, Dorothy. Bit late for a social call, isn't it?" Dorothy's pale blue eyes seemed sharper than usual, studying his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "Saw your lights on, thought you might be having trouble sleeping." "This weather always makes my bones ache something fierce." She stepped inside without invitation, as she had dozens of times before. But tonight Frank noticed how her gaze swept the room, cataloging details. Her eyes lingered on the laptop on the floor, the scattered towels he'd used to clean Maria's blood, the displaced cushions on the couch. "You've been busy tonight," she observed, setting the casserole on his kitchen counter. "Spring cleaning in the middle of winter?" "Just rearranging some furniture," Frank replied, positioning himself between Dorothy and the couch where Maria was hiding. Rex had moved to block the hallway, his body tense. Dorothy's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind her eyes. "You know, Frank, Pine Ridge is such a small town. Hard to keep secrets when everyone knows everyone else's business." "I suppose that's true," Frank said carefully. "Take Sheriff Morrison, for example. Good man, but he's been under a lot of stress lately." "Federal agents poking around asking questions about things that don't concern them?" Dorothy moved closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Sometimes outsiders come to town thinking they understand how things work here, but they don't appreciate the delicate balance we've built." Frank felt ice forming in his veins. "What kind of balance?" "The kind that keeps this town prosperous, Frank. That keeps your VA benefits flowing, your medical bills manageable, The kind that makes sure old soldiers like you can live out their days in peace." Dorothy's hand rested on the kitchen counter, inches from the knife block. Unless, of course, they start interfering in things that don't concern them. Rex's growl deepened, and Dorothy glanced at the German shepherd with distaste. "That dog's been acting strange lately, almost like he's remembering things. Military dogs have such good memories, don't they?" "Sometimes they remember things it would be better to forget." Frank's mind raced. Dorothy wasn't just Morrison's ally, she was part of the operation. Probably had been for years, using her position as the town's beloved grandmother figure to gather intelligence, monitor threats, maintain the network's security. "I think you should leave, Dorothy," Frank said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "Of course, dear. But first I should probably mention that there was a report of gunshots in the woods tonight. Sheriff Morrison is organizing a search party. They'll be going door to door, checking on everyone's safety." Her smile was predatory now. "I'd hate for them to find anything concerning." The threat was crystal clear. Frank had minutes, maybe less, before Morrison's people arrived to finish what they'd started with Maria. But Dorothy had made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated the old Marine and his faithful companion. Frank moved with surprising speed for a 75-year-old man, grabbing Dorothy's wrist as her hand went for the knife. Rex bounded forward with a bark that shook the windows, positioning himself between Dorothy and the door. "You killed my son," Frank said, his voice low and dangerous. "You and Morrison and whoever else is running this show. Danny died because he was trying to do the right thing." Dorothy's mask finally slipped, revealing the calculating predator beneath. "Your son was a naive fool who couldn't leave well enough alone, just like his father." In the distance, Frank could hear engines approaching, multiple vehicles, moving fast through the snow-covered streets of Pine Ridge. The final confrontation was coming, and Frank Sullivan was about to discover whether 5 years of grief had broken him completely or forged him into something harder than steel. Frank's grip tightened on Dorothy's wrist as the sound of approaching vehicles grew louder. Rex positioned himself by the front door, his massive frame blocking any escape route, amber eyes locked on the woman who had just revealed herself as an enemy. "Let me go, Frank," Dorothy hissed, her grandmother mask completely discarded now. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. This operation has been running for 15 years. We have judges, federal agents, state politicians on our payroll. You think one broken-down Marine and his dying dog can bring us down?" Frank's jaw tightened at the mention of Rex's condition. "Maybe not, but I'm sure as hell going to try." Behind the couch, Maria Santos stirred, her FBI training overriding her injuries as she recognized the urgency in Frank's voice. She managed to pull herself upright, her service weapon drawn despite the tremor in her hands from blood loss. "Dorothy Henderson," Maria said, her voice steady despite her condition. "Or should I say Dorothy Castellanos? We've been tracking your financial records for months. 12 different bank accounts, property investments in 3 states, all funded by drug money." Dorothy's pale eyes shifted between Frank and Maria, calculating odds, looking for advantages. "Clever girl. Shame you won't live to see your investigation completed." The engines outside had stopped. Frank could hear car doors slamming, boots crunching through snow. Rex's ears swiveled toward the sounds, his training from Afghanistan making him hyper-aware of tactical movements around the house. "Back door," Frank whispered to Maria. "There's a path through the woods that leads to the old ranger station. Rex knows the way." But as they moved toward the kitchen, Dorothy called out in a voice that carried clearly through the thin walls, "Bobby, they're in here. The FBI agent is alive." Frank cursed under his breath as heavy footsteps surrounded the house. Flashlight beams swept across the windows, and he could hear Sheriff Morrison's voice coordinating his men. "Sullivan, come out with your hands visible. We know you're harboring a fugitive." Frank almost laughed at the audacity. A fugitive. Maria Santos was a federal agent investigating corruption, and Morrison was calling her a fugitive. "Go to hell, Bobby," Frank called back, pulling Maria deeper into the house. Rex followed, his massive frame moving with surprising stealth for such a large dog. The kitchen window exploded inward as a tear gas canister crashed through the glass. Frank grabbed wet towels from the sink, tossing one to Maria and pressing another to his own face. Rex whined at the chemical smell but stayed close, his loyalty overriding his discomfort. "This is your last warning, Frank," Morrison's voice boomed from outside. "Send out the FBI agent and we can discuss terms. Keep protecting her, and you'll end up like your son." The casual mention of Danny's death snapped something inside Frank. 5 years of grief transformed into cold, focused rage. He'd lost his wife to cancer, his son to these bastards' greed, and now they wanted to take Maria too. Some things were worth dying for. "Rex, basement," Frank commanded, and the German Shepherd bounded down the narrow stairs to the root cellar Frank had dug decades ago. Maria followed, stumbling but determined. Frank grabbed his father's old hunting rifle from the gun cabinet, a weapon he hadn't touched since Danny's funeral. The basement was dark and cramped, filled with canned goods and emergency supplies Frank had accumulated over the years. But it had one crucial advantage: a tunnel that connected to the old mine shaft system dug during Pine Ridge's silver mining days in the 1880s. "You know about the tunnels?" Maria asked, impressed despite their desperate situation. "Danny and I explored them when he was a kid. Rex has been down here too. He knows the way to the ranger station." Frank checked the rifle's action, muscle memory from 50 years ago guiding his hands. "The question is whether you're strong enough to make the trip." Maria gritted her teeth, pressing a hand to her wounded shoulder. "I've made it this far." Above them the house shook as Morrison's men broke down the front door. Frank could hear them moving through the rooms, searching, calling out tactical positions. Dorothy's voice guided them, telling them about the basement entrance. "They'll find us in minutes," Maria whispered. Frank nodded, then did something that surprised even him. He knelt beside Rex and looked the German Shepherd in the eyes that held intelligence, loyalty, and the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime spent serving others. "I need you to do something for me, boy." "Something important." Frank's voice was steady, but his hands shook as he removed Rex's collar. Hidden beneath the leather, secured with tape and wire, was a second micro SD card. "Danny gave this to you before he died, didn't he? You've been carrying it all this time." Rex's tail wagged once, a confirmation that broke Frank's heart. His son had trusted his faithful companion with evidence, hoping it would someday find its way to someone who could use it, someone like Frank. "Good boy. Such a good boy." Frank's voice cracked as he pocketed the card. "Now I need you to lead Maria through the tunnels. Get her to safety." Maria grabbed Frank's arm. "What about you?" "Someone needs to slow them down. Give you time to reach the ranger station and call for backup." Frank's smile was grim but determined. "Besides, I've got some unfinished business with Sheriff Morrison." The basement door crashed open above them, and flashlight beams pierced the darkness. Frank pushed Maria toward the tunnel entrance where Rex was already waiting, his intelligent eyes understanding the gravity of the situation. "There's a radio at the ranger station," Frank whispered urgently. "Emergency frequency 14652. Tell them Agent Frank Sullivan, Marine Corps ID 2847563, is calling in federal backup to Pine Ridge. They'll route you to the right people." "Agent Sullivan?" Maria questioned. "Retired military intelligence. Some clearances never really expire." Frank's grin was sharp as a blade. "Now go. Rex will protect you." As Maria and Rex disappeared into the tunnel, Frank positioned himself at the bottom of the basement stairs. The rifle felt familiar in his hands, like greeting an old friend. Above him, boots thundered across his kitchen floor. "Basement's clear," someone called out. But Frank knew they hadn't looked hard enough yet. When the first deputy appeared at the top of the stairs, Frank was ready. "That's far enough, son. You might want to reconsider your career choices." The deputy, Frank recognized him as Miller, a kid who'd grown up in Pine Ridge, froze when he saw the rifle pointed at his chest. "Mr. Sullivan, Sheriff Morrison just wants to talk." "I'll bet he does." Frank's voice carried the authority of a man who'd commanded Marines in combat. "Tell your boss that if he wants to chat, he can come down here himself. Just him." Miller disappeared, and Frank could hear urgent, whispered conversations above. After several minutes, heavy footsteps descended the stairs. Sheriff Bobby Morrison appeared, his hands raised but his eyes cold with calculation. "Hello, Frank. Been a long time since it was just you and me." Frank studied the man who'd once saved his life in a burning helicopter. Morrison was heavier now, gray-haired and thick around the middle, but his eyes held the same predatory intelligence that had made him a good soldier and, apparently, an effective criminal. "Not long enough, Bobby. I know what you did to Danny." Morrison's expression didn't change. "Your boy was collateral damage. Nothing personal." "Nothing personal?" Frank's finger tightened on the trigger. "You had my son murdered because he stumbled onto your drug operation. How is that not personal?" "Because it was business, Frank. Pure and simple. Danny was asking the wrong questions, getting too close to the supply chain we'd established through Afghanistan. We couldn't let one idealistic kid bring down an operation that was funding black ops the government couldn't officially support." Frank felt his world shift again. "Government sanctioned?" Morrison shrugged. "Off the books. Need-to-know basis?" "The money from the drug operation helped fund operations against terrorist cells, arms deals with allies, intelligence gathering. Your son died serving his country, just not in the way you thought." "You're lying." "Am I? Check the second SD card your dog's been carrying." "Danny found our financial records, traced the money flow. Some of it went into private pockets, sure, but most of it went to fund operations that kept American soldiers alive." Morrison stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Your son died protecting national security, Frank. Just like you would have, in his position." Frank's rifle wavered. The idea that Danny's death might have served some greater purpose, might not have been senseless murder, shook him to his core. But then he thought of Maria, bleeding and desperate, carrying evidence of corruption that went far beyond military black ops. "Even if that's true," Frank said, his voice hardening again, "it doesn't justify what you've become. Protecting drug dealers, murdering federal agents, threatening innocent people. You've forgotten what we swore to protect." Morrison's mask of reasonableness slipped. "I've protected this town for 20 years. Kept the federal government from sticking its nose where it doesn't belong. Pine Ridge prospers because of what I've built here. Built on blood and lies. Built on pragmatism. The world isn't black and white anymore, Frank. It's all shades of gray, and the people who survive are the ones who adapt." Above them, Frank could hear movement as Morrison's men searched the house more thoroughly. Soon they'd find the tunnel entrance and Maria's head start would evaporate. "Where's the FBI agent, Frank? Make this easy on yourself." Frank's smile was cold as winter wind. "She's somewhere you'll never find her. Rex is protecting her now, and that dog would die before he'd let anyone harm someone under his protection." Morrison's face darkened. "That animal should have been put down years ago. Military dogs with PTSD are dangerous, unpredictable. Rex doesn't have PTSD, Bobby. He has purpose. Something you lost a long time ago." The two old soldiers stared at each other across a basement that suddenly felt like a battlefield, the weight of decades and betrayals settling between them like dust. Outside, the storm continued to rage, and somewhere in the tunnels beneath Pine Ridge, a wounded FBI agent and a dying German shepherd were carrying the truth toward the light. Frank Sullivan had spent 5 years running from his past. Now, finally, he was ready to face it head-on. The standoff in Frank's basement stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. Morrison's eyes never left the rifle barrel pointed at his chest, while Frank's weathered hands remained steady despite the arthritis that plagued his joints. Above them, the sound of boots on floorboards marked the systematic search of his home, the place where he'd built a life with Martha, where Danny had taken his first steps, where memories lived in every corner. "You know, this ends badly for you either way," Morrison said, his voice carrying the practiced calm of a man who'd negotiated with hostage-takers and drug dealers. "Even if you kill me, my men will hunt down that FBI agent. She's bleeding, probably going into shock, traveling through freezing tunnels with a sick dog. How long do you think she'll last?" Frank's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He was counting seconds in his head, estimating how long it would take Rex to guide Maria through the tunnel system to the old ranger station. The German shepherd knew those passages better than any human. Frank had taken him exploring there dozens of times over the past 5 years, both of them seeking solace in the darkness. "You always were stubborn," Morrison continued, taking a half-step closer. "Remember that Firebase Charlie incident? You held that position for 6 hours with a dislocated shoulder rather than fall back and leave those wounded Marines." "Don't," Frank warned. "Don't you dare use Vietnam to justify what you've become." "What I've become?" Morrison's laugh was bitter. "I'll tell you what I became, Frank. I became a realist. You know what happened when we came home from that war? Nothing. No parades, no heroes welcome, just protesters spitting on us and politicians pretending we didn't exist. I learned that idealism gets you killed, and loyalty is a luxury poor men can't afford." Frank thought of his son's flag-draped coffin, of the military honor guard that had presented him with the folded stars and stripes, the same flag that now sat in his bedroom dresser beneath Danny's high school graduation photo and his acceptance letter to Colorado State. "So you decided to profit from misery instead?" "I decided to survive. And for 20 years I've kept this town safe, prosperous, and free from federal interference. The drug money built our new school, funded the volunteer fire department, paid for medical equipment at the clinic. You think I'm some kind of monster? But I'm the reason Pine Ridge isn't another dead mining town with boarded-up storefronts and kids who can't wait to leave." Morrison's words carried a grain of truth that made Frank's stomach clench. Pine Ridge was prosperous compared to other rural Montana towns. The main street was lined with thriving businesses, the school had modern computers and updated textbooks, and the medical clinic could handle everything short of major surgery. Frank had never questioned where the money came from. He'd been too lost in his own grief to care about civic improvements. "Blood money," Frank said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Survival money. You think the federal government gives a damn about places like this? We're flyover country, Frank. Forgotten people in forgotten places. We take care of ourselves because nobody else will." Above them, a voice called out, "Sheriff, found something in the bedroom. Looks like plans or maps." Morrison's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Military maps, I'd guess. Your boy always was thorough. Those tunnel layouts will help my men track down your FBI friend." Frank's blood ran cold. He'd forgotten about the topographical maps he and Danny had used to explore the old mine system. The detailed charts showing every passage, every dead end, every connection to the surface were tacked to his bedroom wall like a memorial to their shared adventures. "Tick-tock, Frank. Every second you waste down here brings my men closer to Agent Santos. She's wounded, exhausted, probably hypothermic by now. Even with your dog guiding her, those tunnels are a maze. One wrong turn and she'll freeze to death in the dark." Frank closed his eyes for a moment, seeing Rex's amber gaze in his mind. The German Shepherd was dying. The cancer was eating him from inside, stealing his strength day by day. But Rex would never abandon Maria, would never stop protecting someone under his care. The dog would guide her to safety, or die trying, just like Danny would have. The realization hit Frank like a physical blow. Rex wasn't just carrying Danny's evidence. He was carrying Danny's spirit, his sense of duty, his willingness to sacrifice everything for what was right. The dog had been waiting 5 years for this moment, for the chance to complete his handler's final mission. "Where's Dorothy?" Frank asked suddenly. Morrison's slight hesitation told Frank everything he needed to know. "Upstairs, helping coordinate the search." "Lying again, Bobby? Dorothy's gone, isn't she? Slipped out the back while we've been talking. She's the real power here, and you're just her attack dog." Morrison's face flushed with anger. "You don't know what you're talking about. I know Dorothy Henderson has been the perfect cover for 20 years. Sweet old grandmother who knows everyone's business, who brings casseroles and gossip, who nobody would ever suspect. I know she's probably got a communication system set up to coordinate operations across 3 states. And I know you're scared of her." The truth hung in the air between them like smoke. Morrison's hand drifted toward his service weapon, and Frank tensed his finger on the rifle trigger. "She saved this town," Morrison said quietly. "Her husband died in the mine collapse of '89, left her with nothing. No pension, no insurance, no way to pay for his medical bills. The mine company declared bankruptcy to avoid lawsuits. Dorothy watched her neighbors lose their homes, their livelihoods, their hope. So she found another way. By becoming a drug dealer. By becoming a survivor. She started small, just moving product for the cartels, taking a percentage. But she was smart, organized, ruthless when she needed to be. Within 10 years, she was running the whole operation from Canada to Colorado, and every dollar she made went back into this community." Frank thought of all the times Dorothy had visited him over the past 5 years, bringing food and conversation during his darkest moments. How many times had she been gathering intelligence, monitoring his emotional state, ensuring he remained isolated and harmless? "She played me," Frank realized. "All these years she's been watching me, making sure I stayed broken and alone. She cared about you in her way, saw you as a fellow veteran who deserved respect. But when you started asking questions about Danny's death, when you began pulling files and making phone calls, she had to take action." Morrison's revelation explained so much. Why Frank's inquiries about his son's death had always hit dead ends, why witnesses had suddenly become unavailable, why military records had been mysteriously misfiled or lost. Dorothy had been orchestrating his isolation, feeding his depression, keeping him from discovering the truth. "She sent Maria's partner into an ambush," Frank said, the pieces falling into place. "Made sure Agent Rodriguez would be alone when your people killed him. Rodriguez was getting too close. He'd identified 3 of our distribution points and was building a RICO case that could have brought down the entire network. Dorothy coordinated with our people in federal law enforcement to set up the meeting that got him killed." The casual way Morrison discussed murder made Frank's finger tighten on the trigger. This man had once been his brother in arms, someone he'd trusted with his life. Now, Morrison talked about killing federal agents like discussing crop reports. And Maria? Santos was supposed to die with her partner. Bad luck that she escaped, worse luck that she made it to your house. But we'll fix that soon enough. In the distance, Frank heard something that made his heart race. The sharp report of gunfire echoing through the mountain air. 3 shots, fired in rapid succession, followed by a longer pause, then 2 more shots. It was a pattern Frank recognized from his military days, a signal Danny had used during their hunting trips to indicate all clear. Rex had reached the ranger station with Maria. They were alive, and they'd made contact with federal backup. Morrison heard it too, his face darkening with the knowledge that his operation was about to be exposed. "Doesn't matter," he said, but Frank could hear the desperation creeping into his voice. "By the time federal agents reach this town, we'll have sanitized everything. Dorothy has contingency plans, escape routes, new identities prepared. You've bought your FBI friend a few extra hours of life, nothing more." "Maybe," Frank said, his voice steady again. "But sometimes a few hours is all it takes to change everything." Outside, Frank could hear vehicles approaching. Not the local cruisers Morrison had brought, but the deeper rumble of federal SUVs and tactical vehicles. Rex had done more than just signal their arrival at the ranger station. Somehow, the old German Shepherd had helped Maria make contact with Agent Chen's backup team. Morrison heard it too, and his hand moved toward his weapon. Frank's rifle swung to track the movement, and for a moment, the two old soldiers faced each other across a chasm of betrayal and broken trust. "Don't make me kill you, Bobby," Frank said quietly. "We both lost enough already." Morrison's hand froze on his gun grip, his eyes meeting Frank's across the dim basement. In that moment, Frank saw not the corrupt sheriff or the drug dealer's enforcer, but the young lieutenant who'd saved his life in a burning helicopter 47 years ago. But the moment passed, and Morrison's face hardened with resolve. "I'm not going to prison, Frank. Not at my age." As Morrison drew his weapon, Frank's training took over, muscle memory from a dozen firefights in Southeast Asian jungles guiding his movements. The choice was made not by the 75-year-old retiree grieving his son, but by the Marine who'd learned that sometimes the only way to protect the innocent was to destroy the guilty. The sound of Frank's rifle echoed through the basement like thunder, and Sheriff Bobby Morrison collapsed against the stairs, his service weapon clattering across the concrete floor. Above them, the house erupted in shouts and running footsteps as Morrison's men realized their leader was down. Frank could hear federal agents identifying themselves, ordering the corrupt deputies to surrender, the organized chaos of a law enforcement operation finally bringing justice to Pine Ridge. But Frank barely heard any of it. He knelt beside Morrison's still form, looking into the eyes of a man who'd once been his brother, feeling the weight of 50 years of friendship and betrayal settling on his shoulders like snow. Frank knelt beside Bobby Morrison's body for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The basement had fallen silent except for the distant sounds of federal agents securing his house, their voices professional and efficient as they processed what had become a crime scene. Blood pooled beneath Morrison's still form, dark against the concrete floor Frank had poured with his own hands 30 years ago. The rifle slipped from Frank's numb fingers, clattering to the floor. His hands shook uncontrollably now, not from age or arthritis, but from the weight of what he'd done. He'd killed a man he'd once called brother, ended a life that had been intertwined with his own since they were young soldiers learning to survive in the hell of Vietnam. Footsteps thundered down the basement stairs, and Frank looked up to see Agent Sarah Chen descending with her weapon drawn, followed by two tactical officers in full gear. She was younger than Frank had expected, maybe 40. With intelligent, dark eyes and the bearing of someone who'd climbed the federal law enforcement ladder through competence rather than politics. "Frank Sullivan?" she asked, her weapon lowering as she assessed the scene. "I'm Agent Chen. Maria Santos is alive because of what you did tonight." Frank nodded but couldn't find his voice. The reality of Morrison's death was settling into his bones like winter cold, and he felt older than his 75 years. He'd survived Vietnam, buried his wife, lost his son, and somehow convinced himself that the worst was behind him. Now, looking at Bobby Morrison's corpse, he realized that some wars never really end. "Sir, I need you to step away from the weapon," one of the tactical officers said gently. Frank complied, moving to the far corner of the basement while the agents secured the scene. Agent Chen holstered her pistol and approached Frank with the careful demeanor of someone trained in crisis intervention. "Maria told me what happened here tonight. What you risked to save her life. Sheriff Morrison and his people killed her partner, Agent Rodriguez, 3 days ago. Without your help, she would have died too." "Where is she?" Frank asked, his voice hoarse. "Medical helicopter evacuated her to Billings 20 minutes ago. She's stable, lost a lot of blood, but she'll make it." "Your dog." Chen paused, and Frank's heart clenched. "Rex guided her through those tunnels even though he was clearly in distress. Maria said he collapsed just after they reached the ranger station. The veterinarian is with him now." Frank closed his eyes, feeling the last foundation of his world cracking. Rex had been his final connection to Danny, the living reminder that his son had loved and been loved in return. If the cancer took Rex tonight, Frank would be truly alone for the first time in his life. "The evidence you provided is extraordinary," Chen continued. "Both SD cards contain enough information to dismantle a drug trafficking network that spans from Canada to Mexico. Financial records, video surveillance, communication intercepts, it's all there. Your son died trying to gather this information." "Morrison said it was sanctioned," Frank said quietly. "That the drug money funded black operations." Chen's expression hardened. "Morrison was a liar and a murderer. There were no sanctioned operations. Danny discovered a corruption ring that had infiltrated military supply chains in Afghanistan, and they killed him to protect their profits. Your son died because he was honest, Mr. Sullivan, because he couldn't be bought." The words should have brought comfort, but Frank felt only emptiness. Danny was still dead, Martha was still gone, and Rex was dying upstairs. Justice was cold comfort when measured against a lifetime of loss. "What about Dorothy?" Frank asked. "Dorothy Henderson has disappeared. We found her house empty, cleaned out professionally, bank accounts closed, no forwarding address. She's been planning her escape for months." Chen's jaw tightened with frustration. "But we'll find her. The evidence on those SD cards implicates her in 17 murders, including your son's. She won't run far enough to escape federal justice." Frank thought of all the times Dorothy had sat in his kitchen, drinking coffee and dispensing grandmother wisdom while secretly orchestrating the murder of federal agents. The betrayal cut deeper than Morrison's corruption because Dorothy had pretended to care, had played the role of concerned neighbor while monitoring him for threats to her operation. The other deputies? 3 surrendered without incident. Miller, Jackson, and Kowalski are all in custody. They're already talking, trying to cut deals. The corruption in the Pine Ridge Sheriff's Department goes back 15 years, but it ends tonight. A commotion upstairs drew their attention, someone arguing with the federal agents securing the scene. Frank recognized the voice. Patricia Williams, the nurse from the medical clinic. She'd been trying to check on Rex. "Let her through," Frank called up the stairs. "She's a friend." Patricia descended carefully, her medical bag in hand and concern etched across her features. She was a sturdy woman in her 40s, divorced with a teenage daughter who'd moved to Pine Ridge 5 years ago to escape an abusive marriage. Frank had always respected her quiet competence and gentle manner with elderly patients. "Frank, I'm so sorry," she said, taking his hands in hers. "About Sheriff Morrison, about everything that's happened tonight. Rex is upstairs. He's weak but stable. The cancer is advancing, but he's still fighting." Frank felt tears he'd been holding back for hours finally break free. Patricia pulled him into a hug, this woman he barely knew, offering comfort in the wreckage of his world. Over her shoulder, he could see Agent Chen and her team processing the crime scene with professional efficiency, photographing Morrison's body and collecting evidence that would tell the story of this night in federal courtrooms. "There's something else," Patricia said softly, "about Dorothy. I need to tell you something I should have said years ago." Frank pulled back to look at her. What? The night your wife died, Dorothy was at the hospital. She volunteered there sometimes, helping with patient transport. Martha was asking for pain medication, but Dorothy told the nurse on duty that you'd requested no additional drugs, said you wanted Martha to pass naturally, without artificial intervention. The words hit Frank like a physical blow. Martha had died in agony, her cancer eating her alive while he held her hand and watched helplessly. The nurses had told him she'd refused additional morphine, wanted to remain conscious for her final hours. "That's not—" Frank's voice broke. "I never said that. I begged them to give her something for the pain." Patricia's eyes filled with tears. "I know. I was there that night, working a double shift. I heard Dorothy talking to Nurse Stevens, saw the look on your face when Martha started screaming. I should have spoken up, should have challenged Dorothy's authority. I've regretted my silence every day since." Frank staggered backward, the full scope of Dorothy's cruelty finally revealed. She hadn't just murdered federal agents and corrupted law enforcement. She'd tortured his dying wife out of some twisted need to maintain control over everyone around her. The basement suddenly felt too small, too confining. Frank needed air, needed space to process this final betrayal. But as he moved toward the stairs, his legs gave out and he collapsed to his knees on the cold concrete. Patricia and Agent Chen rushed to help him, but Frank waved them away. He needed this moment of broken defeat, needed to feel the full weight of 20 years of manipulation and lies before he could find the strength to stand again. The revelation about Martha's final hours shattered something fundamental inside Frank Sullivan. He remained on his knees in the basement, surrounded by federal agents and the body of a man he'd once called brother, while the truth carved through him like shrapnel. Dorothy Henderson hadn't just orchestrated his son's murder. She'd tortured his dying wife out of pure malice, ensuring Martha's final moments were filled with agony instead of peace. Agent Chen knelt beside him, her voice gentle but urgent. "Mr. Sullivan, we need to get you upstairs. The paramedics want to check you over, and there are questions we need to ask while the details are fresh." Frank nodded but couldn't seem to make his legs work. The weight of 20 years of manipulation pressed down on him like a collapsed building. Every kindness Dorothy had shown, every casserole she'd brought, every concerned question about his health, all of it had been performance, a way to monitor and control him while she ran her criminal empire from behind a grandmother's mask. Patricia Williams crouched on his other side, her medical training taking over. "Frank, you're in shock. Let us help you." She took his pulse, checking his eyes for signs of concussion or stroke. "Your heart rate is elevated but steady. Can you tell me what year it is?" 2024, Frank whispered. "October 15th, Tuesday night." The mundane details felt surreal after the violence of the past few hours. "Good. Now let's get you upstairs to Rex. He's been asking for you." The mention of his faithful companion gave Frank the strength to stand. Rex had guided Maria through the tunnels despite his own pain, had completed Danny's mission even while cancer ate away at his strength. If the German Shepherd could find the courage to keep fighting, so could Frank. They climbed the basement stairs slowly, Frank's arthritis protesting every step. His living room had been transformed into a federal crime scene, with agents photographing evidence and documenting the night's events. Through his front window, Frank could see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles, neighbors gathered despite the late hour, and media vans already arriving from Billings and Great Falls. Rex lay on a blanket near the fireplace, his massive frame looking smaller somehow, diminished by pain and exhaustion. The German Shepherd's amber eyes found Frank immediately, and his tail managed a weak wag. A young veterinarian knelt beside him, checking his vitals with practiced efficiency. "How is he?" Frank asked, settling onto the floor beside his companion. "Tired but stable," the vet replied. "The cancer is advanced, but he's not suffering right now. His breathing is labored, and his temperature is slightly elevated, but these could be symptoms of stress rather than disease progression. Frank ran his hand along Rex's head, feeling the familiar texture of the dog's coat. Rex leaned into the touch, a soft whine escaping his throat, not of pain, but of contentment. This was where he belonged, beside the old Marine who'd given him purpose after Danny's death. "There's something else," Agent Chen said, approaching with 2 evidence bags. "We found these in Dorothy Henderson's house before she fled." She held up the bags, revealing a collection of photographs and documents. Pictures of you, your daily routines, medical records from the VA hospital. She's been monitoring you for years, Frank. Every aspect of your life. Frank examined the photos through the plastic evidence bags. Pictures of him walking Rex, shopping at the grocery store, sitting on his front porch reading the newspaper. Some were taken with telephoto lenses from considerable distance. Others appeared to be shot from Dorothy's own property. The invasion of privacy was staggering, but what disturbed Frank most was the clinical notation on the backs of several photos. Dates, times, emotional assessments written in Dorothy's neat handwriting. "Subject appears depressed," read one notation. "Isolation protocol successful." "Grief response intensifying," said another. "Recommend increased contact frequency." Frank realized that Dorothy had been treating him like a laboratory specimen, adjusting her approach based on his emotional state. When he seemed to be recovering from his losses, she'd increase her visits, bring more food, engage him in longer conversations, all designed to keep him dependent and isolated. "She was afraid you'd start investigating Danny's death more thoroughly," Chen explained. "Your son had sent letters home expressing concerns about supply chain irregularities in Afghanistan. Dorothy needed to ensure you never connected those concerns to his death." Patricia Williams sat beside Frank, her own anger evident. "I should have seen it, should have recognized what she was doing to you, to this whole community. Dorothy was always inserting herself into medical situations, offering to help with patient care. I thought she was just a dedicated volunteer." "She fooled everyone," Frank said quietly. "That was her gift, making people trust her, depend on her, even when she was destroying their lives." Agent Chen pulled out her phone as it buzzed with an incoming call. After a brief conversation, she hung up and turned to Frank. "That was Agent Santos calling from the hospital in Billings. She's stable, out of surgery, and asking about you and Rex. She wanted me to tell you that the evidence you provided has already led to arrests in 3 states. Dorothy Henderson's network is unraveling." Frank felt a flicker of satisfaction, but it was quickly overwhelmed by exhaustion. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the night's events was wearing off, leaving him feeling every one of his 75 years. "What happens now?" he asked. "We'll need your testimony for the trials," Chen replied, "both about tonight's events and anything you can remember about Dorothy's behavior over the years. The defense attorneys will try to paint Morrison and his people as local cops who got in over their heads, but your testimony will help establish the premeditation and scope of their crimes." Frank nodded, then looked down at Rex. The German shepherd's breathing had become more labored, and his eyes held a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. Frank had seen that look before, in the eyes of dying soldiers who'd completed their final mission and were ready to rest. "How long does he have?" Frank asked the veterinarian. "Days, maybe a week. The cancer has spread to his lungs and liver. We could try aggressive treatment, but at his age and with this level of advancement," the vet's expression was gentle but honest, "he's not in pain right now. When the time comes, it will be peaceful." Frank felt tears burning his eyes again. Rex had been his lifeline for 5 years, the living connection to his son that had kept him from drowning in grief. Soon, that connection would be severed, leaving Frank alone with memories and the weight of truths he wished he'd never learned. Patricia placed her hand on Frank's shoulder. You don't have to face this alone. There are people in this community who care about you, who've been wanting to help but didn't know how. Rex brought us together tonight, but we can stay connected. Frank looked around his living room, seeing familiar faces among the federal agents. Tom Bradley from the hardware store was there, along with Sarah Martinez from the diner and old Pete Kowalski from the VFW post. They'd all come when they heard about the shootout, drawn by concern for their neighbor, despite the late hour and dangerous circumstances. Dorothy tried to isolate all of us, Patricia continued. She fed us information designed to keep us apart, made us suspicious of each other, prevented the kind of community bonds that might have threatened her operation. But that ends tonight. Agent Chen cleared her throat. Mr. Sullivan, there's one more thing. The Department of Justice is recommending you for the Citizens Medal of Valor. What you did tonight, protecting a federal agent, preserving critical evidence, stopping a criminal network, it's exactly the kind of courage that medal was created to recognize. Frank almost laughed. A medal for shooting an old friend in his own basement, for discovering that his life had been manipulated by a woman he'd trusted. But then he thought of Maria Santos, fighting for her life in a Billings hospital, and of his son Danny, who died trying to do the right thing. Danny should get the medal, Frank said. He's the one who gathered the evidence, who died trying to stop these people. I just finally did what I should have done 5 years ago. Your son's sacrifice will be acknowledged, Chen assured him. The Army is reviewing his case for posthumous honors. His death in Afghanistan will be reclassified from combat casualty to line-of-duty murder, which means his service record will reflect the truth of what happened. Rex stirred beside Frank, lifting his massive head with visible effort. The German shepherd's eyes found Frank's face, and in that amber gaze Frank saw something he'd been missing for 5 years: peace. Rex had completed his mission, had protected the innocent, and served justice. The dog could rest now, knowing his handler's death had finally been avenged. Frank leaned down and whispered in Rex's ear, words meant only for the faithful companion who'd carried Danny's secrets through 5 years of waiting. Good boy. Such a good boy. You can rest now. We did it, Rex. We finally did it. As if understanding, Rex closed his eyes and settled his head back on the blanket. His breathing became more regular, and for the first time in months, his body relaxed completely. The cancer was still there, still stealing his strength day by day, but the weight of duty had finally been lifted from his shoulders. Frank remained beside Rex as the federal agents continued their work, as neighbors came and went offering support, as the media gathered outside to document the end of Dorothy Henderson's 20-year reign of terror. The old Marine and his faithful companion sat together in the warm glow of the fireplace, surrounded by the debris of shattered illusions, but also by the promise of truth finally told. The hardest part was over. Justice had been served. The guilty would face consequences, and the memory of Danny Sullivan would be honored rather than forgotten. Frank Sullivan had lost everything that mattered to him. But in the process, he'd found something he thought was gone forever: the knowledge that he'd fought the good fight and emerged victorious. Rex's tail gave one final gentle wag against the blanket, and Frank knew that whatever came next, they'd face it together, just as they had faced everything else since that terrible day when Danny's flag had come home without him. 6 months later, Frank Sullivan stood beside a granite headstone in Pine Ridge Cemetery, holding a wreath of pine boughs and red roses. The spring sun warmed his shoulders as he read the inscription he'd had carved into the black stone: Rex, faithful companion, hero, guardian, he never forgot his mission. The German shepherd had passed peacefully 3 weeks after that terrible October night, slipping away in his sleep while Frank held vigil beside him. The veterinarian said Rex's heart had simply stopped, worn out from cancer and a lifetime of loyal service. Frank knew better. Rex had held on just long enough to see justice done, to know that Danny's death had been avenged, and the truth finally told. Behind Frank, the town of Pine Ridge bustled with quiet activity. The corruption trials had concluded 2 months ago, with 3 former deputies sentenced to federal prison and Morrison's estate seized to compensate victims of the drug trafficking network. Dorothy Henderson remained a fugitive, though Agent Chen had assured Frank that federal marshals were closing in on her location somewhere in South America. "Thought I might find you here," a familiar voice said behind him. Frank turned to see Maria Santos approaching, walking with only a slight limp from her injuries. She looked healthier than when he'd last seen her in the hospital. Color had returned to her cheeks, and her dark eyes held the sharp intelligence that had impressed him during their first desperate meeting. "Agent Santos," Frank said, offering a slight smile. "I heard you were back in Montana." "It's Special Agent in Charge Santos now," she replied with a grin. "They promoted me after the Henderson case wrapped up, and it's Maria. I think we're past formalities." Frank nodded, placing the wreath at Rex's headstone. "What brings you back to Pine Ridge?" "Several things, actually. The FBI is establishing a permanent field office here. Too much cross-border trafficking activity to leave unmonitored. I volunteered to head the operation." Maria's expression grew serious. "There's also the matter of the reward money." Frank frowned. "Reward money?" "The Department of Justice authorized a substantial payment for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the Henderson network. Your evidence was instrumental in securing those convictions." Maria handed him an envelope. "It's enough to cover Rex's medical bills, with quite a bit left over." Frank opened the envelope and stared at the check inside. More money than he'd seen since his working days, enough to pay off his mortgage and live comfortably for his remaining years. But the sum felt hollow somehow, payment for losses that couldn't be quantified in dollars. "There's something else," Maria continued. "The town council has asked me to speak with you about taking on a consulting role with the new police department. Pine Ridge needs leadership they can trust, and your military background combined with what you did that night—" "I'm 75 years old," Frank interrupted. "My law enforcement days ended 50 years ago. Age brings wisdom, and after what this community has been through, they need someone who can't be bought, intimidated, or manipulated." Maria's voice carried conviction. "Think about it, Frank. Rex spent his final months protecting this town. Maybe it's time you did the same." Frank looked around the cemetery, noting the fresh flowers on Martha's grave, the small American flag planted beside Danny's memorial marker. Patricia Williams had been maintaining both sites, along with Rex's new headstone, despite Frank's protests that she didn't need to go to such trouble. "Patricia's been taking good care of things," Maria observed, following his gaze. "She's a good woman, better than I deserve." Frank's voice carried genuine affection. Over the past 6 months, Patricia had become a constant presence in his life. Not romantic, but something deeper. A friendship forged in crisis and strengthened by shared purpose. "She cares about you. The whole town does, from what I can see. You gave them something they'd lost under Dorothy's rule, hope that decent people could still win against corruption." Frank thought about the changes he'd witnessed in Pine Ridge over the past months. Neighbors who'd been suspicious and isolated under Dorothy's influence were talking to each other again, forming the kind of community bonds that made small towns worth preserving. The diner served as an unofficial town hall where problems were discussed and solutions proposed. People looked each other in the eye again, trusting that their words wouldn't be reported to hidden authorities. "What happened to the drug money?" Frank asked. "The assets Dorothy's people accumulated over 20 years? Seized by the federal government, but there's a process for returning funds to communities harmed by criminal enterprises. Pine Ridge will see most of that money come back in the form of infrastructure improvements, education funding, and social services. Maria smiled. Dorothy was right about one thing. This town deserved better than poverty and neglect. She just went about it the wrong way. A gentle breeze stirred the pine trees surrounding the cemetery, carrying the scent of new growth and spring rain. Frank felt something shift inside him, a loosening of the grief and guilt that had defined his existence for so long. Rex was gone. Danny was gone. Martha was gone. But their influence lived on in the choices Frank made each day. The consulting position, Frank said slowly. What would it involve? Training new officers, reviewing procedures, serving as a liaison between local and federal law enforcement. Part-time work, mostly advisory, the kind of thing that would honor your son's memory while keeping you connected to the community. Frank knelt and touched Rex's headstone one final time, feeling the smooth granite warm under his palm. "You think he'd approve?" he asked quietly. "I think Rex would be proud to see you still fighting the good fight," Maria replied. "Just like Danny would be." As they walked back toward town together, Frank felt something he hadn't experienced in years, anticipation for tomorrow. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Rebuilding trust and ensuring Pine Ridge's prosperity without corruption would take time and dedication. But for the first time since his family's deaths, Frank Sullivan had a purpose beyond simple survival. Behind them, Rex's memorial caught the afternoon light, a reminder that loyalty, courage, and sacrifice could triumph over even the darkest deceptions. The faithful German Shepherd had completed his final mission, and now it was Frank's turn to carry on the work of protecting the innocent and serving justice. Some bonds truly couldn't be broken, not even by death. Frank Sullivan's story reminds us that it's never too late to find purpose again. At 75, after losing his wife, son, and beloved dog, Rex, Frank discovered that his greatest chapter was still unwritten. Like many of us in our golden years, he felt forgotten by a world that seemed to value youth over wisdom, isolated in a community where he'd once belonged. But when crisis came, Frank's lifetime of experience, his military training, and his unshakable moral compass became exactly what was needed to save lives and restore justice to his town. His partnership with Rex, a dying German Shepherd carrying his son's final mission, proved that loyalty and love transcend even death. Frank found that his accumulated years weren't a burden, but a treasure trove of skills, knowledge, and integrity that no young person could match. In serving others, he rediscovered his own worth. Pine Ridge didn't just need Frank's help, they needed his leadership, his steady hand, his refusal to compromise his values. Sometimes our most meaningful contributions come not despite our age, but because of it. Our scars become our strength, our losses become our wisdom, and our final acts become our greatest legacy. Have you ever felt like your best years were behind you, only to discover new purpose later in life? What experience from your past has unexpectedly become valuable in helping others today? Share your story in the comments below. Your wisdom might be exactly what someone else needs to hear.